Thank you. And let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Father Gain and the Thomistic Institute here at the Angelicum for their kind invitation to present this talk. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this conversation with all of you. The issue I've been asked to address is whether the doctrine of original sin is in Scripture. Now, on one hand, this is obviously a highly loaded way of asking the question. On the other hand, I think it's probably the only way that it can be properly framed. But before I can venture an answer, I need to address three matters of prolegomena that bear on this question. First, which scripture are we referring to? Second, what does it mean for something to be in this scripture? And three, what parts of the doctrine are primarily at stake in relating it to this scripture? So first, which scripture? The doctrine of original sin is typically anchored in multiple passages of scripture, especially Genesis 3, Psalm 51, and Romans 5. Some other passages are sometimes cited as well. The shortest distance from Scripture to the doctrine is probably Romans 5, especially in its Latin form. But for many, that passage simply raises the question of whether Paul himself has misread the Garden of Eden story. Historically, beginning with Ambrose and Augustine, Psalm 51 has often been cited, but it's mainly verse 5 that is in play, and what precisely that verse means in terms of transmission and whether it's a general anthropological principle are fraught issues. So in many ways, Genesis 3 remains ground zero, and its interpretation, in my view, remains a sine qua non of the doctrine. So given that a paper of this length can only do so much, and that it seems best to focus on perhaps the most critical passage for the doctrine, I will consider the question restated as, is the doctrine of original sin in Genesis 3? The second matter of prolegomena concerns what it means for a doctrine to be in Scripture, in this case, Genesis 3. Early in her study of the historical development of original sin, Tatha Wiley raises this issue and rightly identifies errors at two extremes. If by this question we mean something like, did the author of Genesis 3 teach the same thing in the same way as Augustine or Trent, for example, then the answer is clearly no. On the other hand, it would be facile and I think equally wrong to suggest, as is sometimes done, that the church or Augustine have imposed the doctrine back onto Scripture in an indefensibly anachronistic way. Wiley herself identifies the phrase in Scripture as a common way of navigating a moderate course between these two extremes. But tellingly, she provides little in the way of understanding what would and would not qualify a particular later development to be justifiably identified as in Scripture, as opposed to, for example, merely based on Scripture or derived from Scripture or something of the sort. As Yaroslav Pelikan says near the beginning of his 5-volume History of Doctrine, quote, tradition without history has homogenized all the stages of development into one statically defined truth. But history without tradition has produced a historicism that relativized the development of Christian doctrine in such a way as to make the distinction between authentic growth and cancerous aberration seem completely arbitrary. And he goes on to say that he's going to try to navigate between the pitfalls of both of those. And I hope to steer a similar course in this paper and show that with respect to Genesis 3, the doctrine of original sin represents a development of authentic growth. Now, the most tepid way of connecting Scripture to a doctrine is to argue that the seeds of the doctrine are there, such that there exists a possible evolution among other possibilities to get to the doctrine. In other words, it is possible to trace a path from one to the other and follow the development, and so it's offered up as one possible understanding. I think this is somewhat inadequate in our case, since all kinds of theological propositions and their opposites can be judged biblical in this most prosaic sense. While in the case of something like original sin, the church claims to speak authoritatively rather than as a purveyor of a possible theological option. Now, this is not the place to get into theories of doctrinal development, but I offer this understanding of in Scripture as defensible within a Catholic framework. While Genesis 3 does not teach the doctrine of original sin in the most narrow sense, it does set a theological trajectory, which necessarily culminated in the formulation of the doctrine in those later contexts. Or put another way, the doctrine of original sin, as articulated by the church in later centuries, has tapped into the theological deep structure of Genesis 3. What Genesis is saying in its own context and through its own particular literary form is substantially in accord with what Augustine and Trent and others were saying in their own context and through the forms of speaking in which they expressed it. This requires recognizing that all articulations of faith, not just the biblical texts themselves, are embedded and conditioned by their contexts and so can never be final expressions without remainder. Further, as Michael Seavald notes, trivial yet necessary is the point that the dogmas of the church are not an end in themselves, but instead serve a function. In all cases, dogma is not the ultimate, but the penultimate element. It aims to proclaim revelation, end quote. This brings us to our third matter of prolegomena. What about the doctrine of original sin are we talking about? And what is the doctrine doing within Christian theology? What aspects of the doctrine are we proposing to locate in Scripture? Do we mean Augustine's classical formulation? Or do we mean the conciliar definition at Trent? Or both? Or something else? These are particularly pressing questions because the doctrine of original sin is one that quickly draws other doctrines into its orbit. Some of these are matters for historical and systematic theologians. For example, how original sin might be formulated in light of evolutionary science or its implications for sacramental theology are separate issues from whether the doctrine is found in Genesis. Thankfully, some of the other presenters will be addressing those. Likewise, recently my colleague Michael Root has argued, I think persuasively, that in light of the medieval debates, Trent specifically declined to define original sin in one particular way or to take a definitive position on its transmission. Therefore, I think for the purposes of my study, a particular view on these issues can be justifiably bracketed out. Similarly, for example, while the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is obviously related to the doctrine of original sin, and in particular to its mode of transmission, I consider this a second-order theological issue of relating the two, since a number of theologians prior to the 19th century affirmed original sin as true to Scripture while remaining doubtful about the Immaculate Conception. Positively, then, I think principally three interrelated claims are at stake when the Church has affirmed this doctrine. First, the universality of sin, and therefore the universal need for redemption. Second, the inevitability of sin for anyone and everyone born into the world according to the normal means. And third, the solidarity of all humans in the reality of sin. So now I think the question before us can be restated as, in its ancient Near Eastern and literary context, does the beginning of Genesis suggest that humans are universally and inevitably bound together in sin? I will argue in the rest of this talk that yes, it in fact does, and to do this, I will focus on some key dynamics in Genesis 3, and then try to show how the theological significance of this reading is amplified or layered as one expands into larger and larger canonical context. We will hopefully see that the aspects of the universality, inevitability, and solidarity of sin emerge together as intrinsic to the theological deep structure of Genesis 3 when it's viewed in these contexts. So turning now to Genesis 3. In contrast to the traditional reading of Genesis 3 as a fall narrative, modern biblical scholars often read it as a maturation narrative, especially because of similarities with other ancient Near Eastern stories like Adapa and Gilgamesh. These modern readings frequently accent the element of acquiring wisdom, complete with the loss of childlike innocence and a social self-consciousness. To be sure, interpreters also frequently emphasize how this transition comes with unintended negative consequences and is thus a thoroughly ambiguous transformation. The now classic example of a modern critical reading which objects to locating the doctrine of original sin in Genesis 3 is that of James Barr in his provocative book, The Garden of Eden and the Hope of Immortality. Barr views the story as about humanity nearly obtaining immortality, but then losing it. But he goes further than most, but not all, in casting the story as about, and this is not an exaggeration, a morally questionable deity who makes an irrational demand only to overreact and punish harshly what is at most a peccadillo. Further, Barr thinks, apparently unaware of his Gnostic predecessors, Barr thinks the serpent was self-evidently telling the truth, and what resulted from the eating of the fruit was neither death nor anything remotely catastrophic. Thus, for him, the story is, his words, an unserious and comic one, not one about the fall of humanity. Now, one way that Barr's challenge can be answered can be seen in another Old Testament theologian, Walter Moberly. Moberly answers Barr by doubling down on the importance of wisdom in the story. He concludes that the point of the story is to lead the reader beyond that surface initial impression that Barr eloquently puts forth into a deeper understanding of what is and is not meant by death as the consequence of disobeying God. He says, quote, "The felt liberation may be misleading, and the sense of impunity illusory. For death may be present metaphorically in a diminution of and alienation within the personal and public life of humanity. If believers have not fully felt the force of the possibility that God's words may not be trustworthy and true, for so much in life seems to contradict them, and the cynic and the doubter is rarely short of evidence to which to appeal, they will not be led into a more searching understanding of the real significance of their beliefs. But such leading is vital to moral and spiritual health," end quote. I think Moberly's basic insight here is correct, that prima facie the reading of Barr is inadequate, and that's by design to lead us to contemplate what's really going on in the story. But I think his insight needs to be developed further with respect both to the nature of the prohibition as well as the consequence of the disobedience. Regarding the prohibition, Barr thinks eating fruit can hardly be as serious as murder, and so cannot possibly bear the weight the doctrine of original sin attributes to it. Now, while there is some truth to this, many church fathers also compared it to Cain's murder in a similar way. I think even a casual perusal of Leviticus or 1 Maccabees also suggests that in ancient Israel, matters of eating were not always as trivial as Barr judges them to be. And likewise, the literary context suggests that in Genesis 2 and 3, the issue of eating is both significant and weighty. For as Michael Legaspi has recently argued, eating shows that as a created being, humans are by nature dependent on God's provision through the rest of creation. Because we are contingent, our lives cannot be our own. Rather, as with the Torah's dietary laws, eating and its restriction expresses humanity's fundamental relationship to God in a visceral, bodily way. Needing to eat, even before the expulsion from the garden, is a constant reminder that we can never be self-sustaining, but require God's ongoing provision. Far from being trivial or incidental, as it may appear to some modern Western readers, The issue of eating is a telling locus for what is theologically at stake in this initial sin. As is well known, the dialogue between the serpent and the woman in 3:1-5 trades on half-truths and equivocations. After feigning uncertainty about what God had commanded, the serpent insinuates that God is the one who is misleading the humans in order to mask his own petty selfishness. He does not want them to become as he is. Then comes the moment of decision. In verse 6, the woman saw that the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eyes and desirable for making one wise. The progression is significant. It begins with the issue at hand: what is and is not good to eat. Up until now, the pronouncement of what is qualitatively good or not has been strictly a divine prerogative. But now the woman appropriates that role for herself. She substitutes her own judgment for God's. In becoming the arbiter of what is good for them, they not only take God's place, but ironically also mirror the selfish autonomy the serpent had convinced them is true of God. The progression then moves to the issue of perception, which here as elsewhere can have the double sense of physical sight as well as comprehension. The final element is the gaining of wisdom, which is equated with being like God's. This recentering of authority from God to herself is paralleled by a subtle narrative technique. Rather than simply reporting actions and speech, the narrator now takes us inside the woman's interior life so that, in the words of Ronald Hendel, we see through her eyes. By this narrative strategy, we see the dawning of the woman's new consciousness and autonomy, end quote. In other words, just as the woman begins to see herself as the reference point for decisions, the reader also begins to see her as the central consideration. And further, by taking the reader into her psychology of temptation, it becomes possible for readers to recognize their own temptations according to the script of the woman's thinking. Interpreters have frequently seen significance in Adam's passivity. She gives him the fruit, and he eats it, without apparently correcting their dialogue or objecting in any way. What is often overlooked is the significance of having both of them involved, even though the commandment was given only to Adam. One can imagine, for example, the Adam-Christ typology working even more smoothly if the transgression had happened before the woman was created. Of course, having the serpent approach Eve allows it to exploit the fact that she was not present when God's command was given. Yet by having the story unfold in this way, the author is able to depict the social nature of the rebellion against God, and more importantly, the care needed in transmitting God's law to other people. Robert Jensen points out that the more individualistic a society is, the more difficult it is to accept the validity of the idea of original sin. Rather, as he puts it, quote, humanity is finally one diachronically extended community. And that community, and we in it, are idolatrous, lustful, unjust, and despairing, end quote. While easy to minimize in modern Western readings, the element of collusion in Adam and Eve's rebellion against God is actually essential to the story. Thus, far from being the petty infraction Barr suggests, Genesis 3 is about what happens when humans, both individually and collectively, deny their own contingency by asserting their autonomy to determine for themselves what is good for them. This becomes especially clear through the subtle narration of the fallout. Despite making themselves coverings of fig leaves, the humans hid themselves as though they know they are inadequate to obviate their accountability to God. And when they are confronted, the responses of the man and woman are highly suggestive. Although the man and woman hide together and ate together, Adam responds in the singular. I heard, I was afraid, I hid. The focus on his interior reaction mirrors the woman's interior thinking in verse 6. while also distancing himself from his wife. This subtly anticipates the way each will blame others for their choices, again pointed out by Ronald Handel. In their blaming of others, the man and woman also conform themselves to the thinking of the serpent. Adam implicitly blames God for giving him the woman who led him astray, similarly to the insinuation of the serpent. And David Carr has pointed out that the woman's response in blaming the serpent is in Hebrew packed with sibilance, so that it actually sounds like she's hissing as she's uttering a half-truth. What this shows, according to Carr, is that the choice to eat the fruit was not simply an isolated wrong decision. It has altered the way humans relate to God and the world around them, including each other. There's one other way the narrative subtly suggests a change in the human condition. After the punishments are doled out in verses 14 and 19, Adam names the woman Eve, and the narrator tells the reader that this is because she will be the mother of the living. While this echoes Adam's role in naming the animals in Genesis 2, there is also a touch of irony here. As modern commentators regularly point out, this kind of name is characteristic of Near Eastern goddesses. Thus, in addition to the knowledge of good and evil, she has become like a god in that way, just not in the way she anticipated. Rather than usurping God as the ruler of her life, she has become subject to death, which can only be survived through the pain of transmitting life through reproduction, signaled by her new name of Eve. Likewise, the blaming and the curses indicate that the expulsion from Eden is not just a change of residence, but a multifaceted alienation. Death is inevitable, and life constantly offers foretaste of it through the fragmentation between humans and God, the earth, and each other. Here, I think modern interpreters often underestimate the change in human nature that attends the consequences of their disobedience. To see why, let's consider Charles Taylor's distinction between what he calls the buffered self and the porous self. According to Taylor, one of the hallmarks of modernity is the tendency to see the self as separated and highly distinct from the world by a firm boundary, which to some significant degree can be regulated by the self. In this view, a person's self is relatively stable and controllable. The effects of the world, including of one's own body, can be filtered, processed, even disengaged from. Identity can be, and often is, conceptualized in terms somewhat independent of the circumstances and context in which one lives. This is what Taylor calls the buffered self. And if we work with this concept of identity, then what occurs in Genesis 3 does not seem to involve any kind of ontological change. Humans disobey, humans suffer consequences, humans are exiled, but there would be nothing in Genesis 3 to indicate any kind of change or corruption of the human's nature or identity. When modern readers disavow interpreting Genesis 3 in terms of original sin, they usually appear to be reading the text on the assumption of a buffered self. In contrast, Taylor suggests that pre-modern people understood the self more or less as porous. By this, he means that the self was understood as thoroughly embedded within the world, and therefore its nature existed and changed in dialectic relationship with the world. There was no possibility of insulating, even heuristically, the self from the outside, including one's own physical body, or even of conceiving of oneself independently from the world in which one existed. The concept of the self is often difficult to imagine for modern people, but Taylor suggests the following illustration in his book, Modern Social Imaginaries. He says, quote, "We can think of contexts that even for us can't be easily thought away. What would I be like if I had been born to different parents? As an abstract exercise, this question can be answered. Answer, like the people who were in fact born to those other parents. But if I try to get a grip on this, probing my own sense of identity, on the analogy with what would I be like if I hadn't taken that job or married that woman and the like, then my head begins to swim. I'm getting too deep into the very formative horizon of my identity to be able to make sense of the question, end quote. So when we think of the state of humanity after the transgression, in the new context of fragmentation, struggle, and exile, in comparison to their previous lives in the garden, the question, what if they had not eaten the fruit, becomes more like, who would I be with different parents than what if I hadn't taken that job? In other words, their identity as those who have in fact eaten the fruit does in fact reconstitute their nature because it necessarily is affected by fundamentally new relationships to God, the world, and each other. And all of these play a role in defining the self. If the self is porous, then the eating of the fruit is not just a discrete action that they did and bears minimal relationship to the nature of their core selves, but it now defines them to some extent as who they are and shapes how they interact with others. And concomitantly, the world they engage is one that is encountered as resistant to them, specifically as those whose identity is ones who have eaten. If Taylor is right, then the first readers of Genesis would have viewed the self as more porous than modern readers do. And therefore, they would have understood the transgression in the garden to have really changed who they were, and by extension, all those who came after them into a world consisting of these disordered relationships. I think this is probably why modern biblical scholars often speak of Genesis 3 as involving permanent change of the human condition, or something of the sort, even if they remain reticent to speak in terms of original sin or a fall. So if the first humans are porous selves that have transformed themselves into those who seek their own autonomy, overestimate their ability to determine their futures, are suspicious and disobedient towards God, and constituted by disordered relationships to all others, then it suggests that the context of the primeval history and the rest of Scripture, this human orientation remains constituent of human life throughout history in a way that dovetails with the articulation of the doctrine of original sin by later Christians. For example, although the Cain and Abel story seems to presuppose a much more populated world, it has likely been placed immediately after Genesis 3 deliberately in order to serve as a paradigmatic account of humanity outside of Eden. Readers have long noticed that there are narrative similarities between the Garden of Eden story and the Cain and Abel story. In both stories, the protagonists are alone at the moment of decision, and they must consider the nature of God's intentions. In both, the protagonists ultimately decide that they know better than God. God then confronts both with the questions involving where and what, and in both stories, a curse is pronounced. The protagonists are warned that hereafter they will struggle against an urge, and then both end in exile to the east. The new state is solemnized by a physical sign that simultaneously hints at grace: garments of skin for Adam and Eve, and a mark for Cain. Yet within this common narrative structure, there are also elements of escalation as well. The serpent persuades Eve to sin, but Cain sins from his own initiative. When God confronts them, Adam dissembles, while Cain responds with seeming belligerence. While Adam and Eve seem to accept their punishment, Cain protests against his. Gordon Wenham rightly concludes that, quote, there is development. Sin is more firmly entrenched, and humanity is further alienated from God, end quote. In fact, this dynamic continues all the way to the flood narrative, which in many ways is the peak of the primeval history. By the time readers reach Genesis 6, they are told that human wickedness now saturates the world, and that God beheld that the earth was corrupted, or in Walter Houston's vivid translation, the earth was wrecked before God. Importantly, this phrasing provides the exact inverse of God's beholding the creation in Genesis 1 and pronouncing it good. Whereas Cain's murder of his brother polluted the land, now the entire earth is filled with corruption. And so humanity must be exiled, not just from a particular place, but from the face of the earth. In fact, in the primeval history, sin itself is depicted as involving a kind of momentum, which ultimately ruins humanity and the world. Or as William Brown puts it, the march of time from one generation to the next is marked by a movement from painful bondage to wrenching alienation, a procession made, his word, inevitable by the introduction of an ontology of violence, end quote. In assessing the importance of the primeval history generally, and Genesis 3 specifically, scholars often point out an important problem. After Genesis 4:1, Adam and Eve all but disappear from Scripture until Paul's epistles. This, however, does not necessarily mean that the narrative is peripheral to Old Testament theology. Rather, there are two ways that these narratives function typologically in the rest of the canon. First, the author of Genesis 2 to 3 has cast this story as a foreshadowing of Israel's entire history. Both are placed in a special, luxurious land and given rest. Both are given a divine command, law. Both are warned of fatal consequences of disobedience. And after disobeying, both are exiled out of their land. Thus, insofar as Israel's propensity to rebel against God conforms to the story of the first humans, their transgression and the resulting expulsion from Eden serve as an inflection point, after which the form of their sinfulness is always below the surface as the family trait, not only of Israel, but of all of humanity. Second, this family trait repeatedly shows up in particular events within Israel's history, as what Gary Anderson calls the doctrine of immediate sin. That is, the propensity of Israel to transgress as soon as they receive divine favor or a command. Immediately after agreeing to the covenant at Sinai, Israel builds a golden calf and commits idolatry. As soon as the cult is inaugurated, Nadab and Abihu bring strange fire and are struck down. As soon as Jeroboam is offered a covenant like David, he builds golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Anderson goes on to argue that Paul has discerned that this same propensity to rebel at first chance is present in the story of the beginning of humanity. As soon as Adam and Eve are given a single command in the garden, they rebel at first opportunity. In other words, rather than blowing Genesis 3 out of proportion, Paul was picking up on a pattern within the Old Testament itself that would account for, in Yaroslav Pelikan's words, the statistical regularity with which men who supposedly faced Adam's possibilities always made Adam's choice, end quote. In addition, in his study of violence in the Old Testament, Matthew Lynch has demonstrated that this understanding of humanity's new ontological state of violence after Eden is also recapitulated through the Old Testament as prophets and sages cast national sin as an extension of both the curse of the land in Genesis 3 and the way the sins of the primeval history damaged the world. For example, Hosea 4 describes how the land languishes because of bloodshed, and Isaiah 24, the land as polluted and cursed because Israel has broken the covenant. In sum, viewed within the whole canon, Genesis 3 sets in motion a pattern which is replicated in a series of vignettes into the human condition as fundamentally alienated from and antagonistic to the goodness of God and his creation. What ties the vignettes of the primeval history together is that story after story, beginning with Adam and Eve, shows humans who refuse to live within the divinely mandated parameters and seek to take what they believe is in their own best interests, whether it's the life of an inconvenient brother or the prerogative to make a name for themselves with a great tower. As Victor Hamilton nicely puts it, Genesis 3 through 11 assembles Narratives whose common theme is, I have not learned in whatsoever state I am to be content. In other words, they are not content simply to exercise the power over nature that God gave them at creation. That is not sufficient power. Their power must be extended to include things like power to be morally autonomous, power over somebody else's life, power over the determination of one's future. Hamilton's description of the common thread through Genesis 3 through 11 could easily be extended to the rest of salvation history and sounds remarkably similar to the description of original sin in the Christian tradition as the privation of original justice. Conclusion. We're now in a position to draw these various threads together. While Barr views Genesis 3 as a lighthearted story in which a small infraction deprives humanity of the chance to become immortal, the nature of the prohibition and its violation, in fact, go directly to the heart of the theological issue at hand. Will these humans recognize their dependency, even contingency, on God for their very existence, and so defer to God's authority and obey God's commands? Or will they take an adversarial stance against God and claim independent autonomy to decide for themselves what is best? Through narrative artistry, Genesis 3 gives the reader an inside view of the woman's recentering of authority within herself, and further, the seriousness of eating the fruit as a paradigmatic transgression becomes clear from the consequences. Their reactions, responses, and expulsion all suggest a transformation in how they view themselves and the world. And yet they cannot escape being confronted with their own limitations and subjection to death. However, their selves are not unaffected by this encounter. Because the self is understood as porous, this alienation from God, from each other, and from the world around them actually does reconfigure who they are as those who have eaten and who are now predisposed toward autonomy, self-reliance, selfishness, and disordered relations. Broadening out to a canonical context, the Old Testament clearly portrays the transformed nature of humanity in Genesis 3 as programmatic for the way all of humanity is. After the inflection point of Adam and Eve's expulsion, the rest of the primeval history portrays each generation as a recapitulation of humanity's will to self-determination, which culminates in the ruin of the world, humans included. Punctuating this is the observation that humanity's disposition is constantly bent towards wickedness, Genesis 6:5, and that even the purge of the flood has not altered this, Genesis 8:21. In addition, other biblical authors frequently diagnose sinfulness in ways that recall the very decision Adam and Eve make, and which is replicated in the rest of the primeval history. It is surely significant as well that so many readers over the centuries have followed these later biblical authors in seeing tremendous explanatory power in the Adam and Eve story. It serves not only as the salvation historical inflection point, but as a story that diagnoses the fundamental issue in all subsequent sins, which readers can recognize within themselves. Therefore, I suggest that the theological deep structure of Genesis 3 within the primeval history suggests a greater role for this primal sin than the low number of explicit citations of the story in later biblical literature might suggest. Rather, the Adam and Eve story itself suggests a fundamental transformation in human nature that explains what readers of every generation recognize within themselves as endemic to their condition. In short, the way Genesis 3 is narrated in its original context, as well as its intertextual relationship with the rest of the canon, is best explained, as the later tradition does, by positing that sin is indeed universal, inevitable, and binds humans together in a solidarity of rebellion. Thank you.